effectively, it was something like what happens when your mission takes you off the mission.
Yeah.
So what happens when your mission takes you off the mission? So something like that anyway. So I'm hoping, actually, I'm going to have a confession. I steal lots of my good ideas from other places. So today, and a little narrative around giving credit when you actually do that. I was actually at a chat at my church. I go to Sanderson Bible Fellowship, if it matters. And was listening to this guest speaker, and he's chatting away, and I'm like, man, this is like, I've heard these thoughts before. So after he was done, I went up and said, hey, you should read this book. It's got lots of similar stuff in it. And he was, oh, yeah, that's where I got my talk from. But he never said that. So anyway, so I'm going to acknowledge up front that I get a lot of what I'm about to say out of this book, which is why I brought it along. So it's Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Balsinger, who's on faculty at Fuller Theological Seminary, and writes a lot about change process and Christian leadership in the midst of change, and uses a really interesting metaphor to talk about change. So really, I'm hopeful, if nothing else, you'll remember the metaphor. This is going to be one of those chats like, dribble, yeah, I can't remember any of it, but yeah, there was that one good metaphor. And hopefully the metaphor is helpful to you. So the other thing I wanted to say is, I've been to these things, I don't know, 7, 8 times, and one of the things I really appreciate about coming here is actually learning more about the situation and the work that we're doing to advance the gospel in Greater Victoria. So I got to admit, this chat's a little bit PCS-centric, and I hope that isn't a problem. So there's lots of PCSism in this, so my apologies. The other thing is I just discovered I'm not very good at flipping my own notes and flipping the slideshow at the same time when they're not the same device, but I'll try to, if you notice that, hey, like he's talking about something that's got no relationship whatsoever to his slide, maybe you could like point over there. This particular book, by the way, that I base this chat on, Canoeing the Mountains, I tend to read a fair bit. And I have a leadership team, we meet weekly. And so at the leadership team, with some frequency, I bring thoughts out of what I'm currently reading. So we usually start off with a kickoff, like a check-in, how are you doing? So it might have a devotional, it usually does. And so often I'll put on a slide something I'm reading currently, a provoking thought. And one of those thoughts that came out of this book is a definition of leadership. So how's this for a definition of leadership, which right up front, I stole. Leadership is disappointing your people at a rate they can absorb. Deeply resonates with me because the process of change for many is inherently disappointing. And in fact, there's a whole chapter in this book about what happens when people who love and care for you stab the change that you're working on in the back. How do you handle that? When you feel called to bring something new to a place, and the people who deeply care for you actually undermine the work that you're doing. It's well worth the read. Oops, that's me being out of sync with my 2 slides. What I'd like you to do, by the way, if you haven't figured it out, I teach for a living. And one of the things that I remember from teacher college, I don't remember much from teacher college, but one of the things I remember is there's activity when you have to do this student teaching kind of gig, and you go out there and they assess you. And I remember being in a classroom and I'm teaching, and the teacher who I had as my mentor teacher was utterly fixated on don't stand in one spot. So he would actually have a chart of his classroom where you're working, and he would draw a line where you were. And if the line looked kind of like you were in trouble, you didn't do it right. So I got heavily fixated right up front as like, you wander when you teach. So I'm not a very good speaker in a typical sense, because they're going to notice that, actually I do streaming at my church, and I hate people who do what I do, which is like wander all over the place. I tend to wander, so my apologies.
They obviously didn't have cameramen back when you went to school.
Yeah. So anyways, I do tend to wander, but I've got a task for you. That's the other thing, is I tend to actually, I'm more of a teacher than a preacher. So the task I'm going to give you, very quickly, I'd like you with, and this is get to know the people. I know we all tend to sit with people we know already, but hopefully there's a bit of a mix happening out there. With the people who are at your table, very quickly chat about what is the mission of the church. What is the mission of the church? For a group of pastors, just saying. So, I am going to dare to actually try to state in 2 points what I believe the mission of the church to be, admitting it's a vast oversimplification, but one is to proclaim the gospel. So I've quoted from Matthew 28, which I'm not going to read out loud. I'm hoping you actually know that passage. You should look it up. It's the Great Commission. It's kind of an interesting passage as an educator, because in the depth of that passage is a lot about forming. And the second passage I'm quoting from, I hope is also really familiar to you, and it's got to do with equipping and supporting believers. You remember the account in the beginning of Acts about the early church and what they did. And that actually was an exciting part of that story, and they added many to their numbers, right? It's pretty compelling. So, but what was going on is they were living together in community, and they were supporting, they were sharing, they were holding things in common. All that, they were praying together. They were the stuff that's happening as community where we equip and support. So I would say at its simplest that the mission of the church is really encapsulated. We could unpack these significantly, but in these 2 frames: proclaiming the gospel and equipping and supporting. So, talking about Lewis and Clark. So the book, Canoeing the Mountains, is really about unpacking the journey of Lewis and Clark. Now I'm assuming, although it's an American narrative, that most of us know Lewis and Clark. They should have some broad sense. Okay, they were a couple guys who made it across the US to the Pacific. So that's their basic narrative. Does anybody remember, I didn't read it intentionally, but I actually showed you the head of that expedition was actually Lewis. They operated as a team. It's a really interesting narrative. Lewis was actually the guy in charge, the guy appointed by the president, who was Thomas Jefferson at the time. So he wrote a letter of appointment saying, here's what your job is. And at its simplest, the mission was to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. But here's the actual, from the letter from Thomas Jefferson: the objective of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean may offer the most direct and practical water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce. So Thomas Jefferson is motivated by this. We want to create trade to the Pacific Ocean, and we believe that the simple route to get from here to there is to go along the Missouri River. So this is the Mississippi River basin, huge basin, which conveniently apparently doesn't include any of Canada. Sorry, just when I Googled Mississippi River basin, it was like they literally cut it. Pretty confident it extends into southern Saskatchewan and a bit of Manitoba. And anyway, so that's the Mississippi River. But you can see on the left the Missouri River, and in fact it goes an awful long ways to the west. So you can see why they might think that, hey, you're trying to discover a route to the Pacific Ocean. That's your objective. But part of your marching orders is to use the Missouri River to do it, because it's going to be a simple task to go up the Missouri River and then keep going and you'll hit the Pacific. That's pretty much Thomas Jefferson's marching orders to Clark and Lewis. And so they go up the Missouri River expecting something to be true. And what they expect to be true is that Western North America is an awful lot like Eastern North America. Now, I actually used to live in New Jersey, and I have a sense of Eastern North America, and I know what we called mountains in New Jersey aren't quite the same thing as what they call mountains in Colorado, for instance, or Montana. And I do know that the experience, because we have the journals, that they were shocked. They got to the headwaters of the Missouri River expecting it to be basically a gradual turn to it started going down, and looked an awful lot like where we came from. We find a new river, put our canoe in the river, and now we're going to take this river to the Pacific Ocean. That's what they thought the task was. What they were confronted with was they got to the headwaters of the Missouri River, looked ahead and saw the Rocky Mountains, extending as far as they could see to the north and to the south. And so they had some decisions to make. Apparently their marching orders left something out of the equation. Now, circling back to the PCS narrative. So we are a nonprofit society, Pacific Christian School. We're actually the Victoria Christian Education Society. And as a nonprofit in British Columbia, under the Societies Act, we have a constitution. And in that constitution, the Societies Act requires that you actually declare the purposes of the society. So many years ago, in the early 1960s, this was written as two of the three statements around what our purposes are. To attract parents who are willing and desirous to seek for their children an education which is directed by God's all-powerful word, and have these children trained to help them acquire and grow in a Christian world and life view. Statement 1. Statement 2, to provide direct advise on, and carry out a curriculum of Christian schools from kindergarten to grade 12 based on the principles as set forth in Articles 1, 2, 3. I'm not going to read the articles to you. They actually have to do with what we believe. There's a statement of religious principles. There's also a statement of some educational principles. That's what those articles are. There's actually a third clause that says, hey, and to own what property we need to do the above. So those are the three things written in 1960. Now here's the thing. I went online and I looked. I'm a visual kind of guy. I like taking photos. Sadly, I don't have any personal photos of this area in the 1960s. Oh, actually, I lived here back then. But Saanich Archives is a great place. I went on the Saanich Archives and I found a picture taken about 2 blocks from PCS. This is 1966, 2 blocks from PCS. You'll see in the foreground a bunch of open space. You may not be able to make out what this is. This is actually a large greenhouse. And then you'll notice encroaching suburbia in the distance. Because in the early 1960s, the place that is now Pacific Christian School was on the edge of Victoria. And so the context was rural, starting to transition to the suburbs. So that's what it was like visually. But what about, perhaps more to the point, let's consider the world of religion in 1960. Now, sadly, it's hard to find really good data going back before the 1980s, although I do have some things I'm going to quote. This is actually a chart compiled from information from StatsCan on the percentage of people who have a declared religious affiliation. So this is when you have the census form, you can tick what religion you identify, if you identify as religious. And the people who have said, I am religiously active, which they've defined as being, I've gone to a religious function in the last month. So, as you can see, there's a pretty predictable timeline or progression downward. So, the number of people who are active in religion currently in Canada is, I would assume as the line continues, is less than 20% of Canadians would be active as defined by going to a religious activity once a month. Now, by the way, I'm not saying Christian, I'm saying a religious activity. So this would include Muslims, Sikhs, Jews, Hindus. But there's definitely a downward trend happening. Finding data on exactly how many people were participating in church in the early 60s is a little difficult, but the Pew Center actually has some research on it from 1962. And they say that in 1962, more than 50%, more than 50% of Canadians would have attended a religious service within the last week. We're not talking months, we're talking within the last week, more than 50%, 52. You know, it wasn't much more than 50%. But so we're now looking at less than 20% within the last month versus 60 years ago, more than 50% in the last week. And we're also talking about the change of demographic in terms of Christian, non-Christian, which is more important in some places than others. I'll show you another chart Oh, this one's an interesting one because it's got to do with, I'm going to flip over, I'm watching my watch here because we're a bit late and I want to make sure we get out on time, but who is the core demographic of who PCS is trying to reach? Remember our mission statement, our purpose statement was to find parents who want for their children. So our primary target is the parent. If you look at this chart, it shows, this is data from 2017 to 19, the study was done, what percentage of people in different age groupings identify as religious and go to church or go to a religious activity. So you can see 1980 to 1999, this would be the core demographic group that Pacific Christian is seeking. These would be the parents. And 61% of that group in Canada, Canadian stat, identify as being religious, not necessarily Christian, but identify as being religious. 18% of that group have been religiously active. And you can also see there's a significant downward trend. So I would anticipate, given that this data is 4 or 5 years old and our parents are younger than this now, or younger demographic, they're the next one on, that the data would be a little bit less. Here's another interesting chart. This is the percentage of people who, according to the last StatScan survey in 2021, who identify as being non-religious. That's green. The percentage of people who identify as being Christian, broadly defined, lighter blue. And the people who would identify as another religious connection, which is the darker navy blue on the right. And so you can see in this 2021 census that in Victoria, more than 60% of people identify as being non-religious. It is just an interesting tidbit. When I've often spoken to people, I come from Kelowna and say, hey, this is what it was like in Kelowna, and they're like, well, that's the Bible Belt.
Kelowna?
Apparently, that's what I say.
I don't think so.
And the data actually doesn't support, like, I mean, Kelowna, yeah, probably a little bit less, but still well over 50% of people in Kelowna identify as being non-religious. The same with Chilliwack. That's where people in BC typically say the Bible Belt is, like Abbotsford, Chilliwack. Over 50% of people in those areas identify as being non-religious. The interesting thing here is Vancouver, while it doesn't, you might think, oh, Vancouver, the most secular of places, what's going on is that actually there's quite a few people moving into Vancouver who don't identify as Christian. So you can see the percentage of people who identify as religious but not Christian in Vancouver is significantly larger. So why is this important? And by the way, sorry, I forgot this slide here. I've given up on my little talk sheet here, so I'm just trying to get through it. First of all, I want to leave you this passage, because I've been through these kind of chats where people present all the data and you're like, oh my goodness, this is ever depressing. And at some level it should be depressing, just to say that. But this is a quote from Revelation 11. The seventh trumpet, the seventh angel sounded the trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Lewis and Clark, they were walking up the mountains, they got to that, and they were confronted. We don't know what's. They had to make a decision. We, on the other hand, we know how the story turns out. So I got to tell you, despite the current statistical challenges that we face that are real, we know how the story ends. So I would not want you to leave this space feeling any depression or any sense of like, we're called to do a work and God's going to triumph. His plan is successful in the end. So what about Lewis and Clark? So how did they react? So they're sitting there in a pass in, I believe, southern Montana, if I remember my geography correctly, and they're just saying, what do we do now? And they have notes. A substantial, they actually operated, believe it or not, it's kind of like a democracy. They took votes. So they sat around and they had a conversation, and not surprisingly, a chunk of the folk on the expedition said, we didn't sign up for this, there's supposed to be another river over the hill there. and we're going to put our boats in the river and we're going to proceed down to the Pacific. This is like, we weren't expecting a mountain range. So a substantial portion of the party voted to turn back. Lewis and Clark said, hey, no, let's look at why we came. We didn't come, we have to look at the deep message in our, the Missouri River isn't the mission. The deeper, that's in the mission statement. This is when I actually said, what's your mission and what's your mission statement? Because their mission, the letter from the president said, take the Missouri. Well, that turns out to be impossible. So they had to look past that and say, what was our real mission here? Was it to take the Missouri, or was it to get to the Pacific Ocean? The real mission was to get to the Pacific Ocean. And that was the conversation that they had. And that was the beginning of a very difficult journey from that point to the Pacific Ocean, which obviously they were successful. You know how that turned out. So what does this mean for PCS? And what does it mean in terms of our context? So remember our purpose. Our purpose was to find parents who are interested in having an education that's founded in God's Word that shapes their children in terms of Christian and biblical worldview. That's what our purpose is in our Constitution. That was written in 1960. So a couple things have changed significantly. One of them, and I'm going to point out the other one in a second, but one of them is that our society is not the same it was in 1960. 1960, I remember listening to Aaron, was it 2 months ago he spoke? I think, something like that. And Aaron was reflecting on, are we at pre-Christian now? Have we gotten so far that we no longer can accurately describe ourselves as post-Christian? Should we actually be talking about ourselves as pre-Christian? In some manners, that's a helpful question to be asking ourselves, because increasingly we're no longer dealing with the people who have disconnected or their families were connected, we're dealing with people who have never connected. They've never had connection to Christian. And so that's what our context is too, is our parent population increasingly have no connection whatsoever to church. So how is that different? From 1960, 52% of people had been to church, not just saying they identify as Christian, had been to church in the last week. That's when that document was written. The reality today is less than 20% of people in Canada have been to any form of religious activity in the last month. So does that matter? Something to ponder. Now, if you've been around schools that have a Christian Reformed heritage, you're going to definitely recognize this picture. You probably recognize it anyway, the one on the right. This is a three-legged stool. And Christian Reformed folk, or schools that were started in a Christian Reformed tradition, which our school not surprisingly was, given that we have a Christian Reformed church on our property, believe that the child is formed through three places or elements that have input in terms of the development of the child. One is the family. That's one leg of this stool. Another leg is the church. And the final leg of this stool is the school. It's based on the work of a guy named Abraham Kuyper, who talked about spheres of authority or control. He was a Dutch theologian and politician. I wonder for us as a school, what does it mean missionally for us to exist in a scenario where I can't rely on all three legs being important in the life of the kid in front of me, of the family in front of me? The family may have disconnected from church. The kid may never have been connected with church. Family, increasingly, I mean, it's no surprise to a group of pastors that people are struggling. And so I can't rely on there being a healthy family situation for the kid who's in front of me. What does it mean to do mission in this very different context? And is it okay just to lean into a model that was built, quite frankly, the three-legged school model was built around 1920. So I think the world has changed a little bit since 1920. A little bit of backdrop on the school, and I'm almost done. I'm watching the clock here. This is an overhead shot of Pacific Christian School. So this is our elementary school, the Victoria Christian Reformed Church, which I'm just going to mention in ending, and our high school. Something that's significant that's changed over Christmas, which some of you will be aware of, is that Pacific Christian School purchase the Victoria Christian Reformed Church property and buildings. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, but I'll tell you how we got there and a few last thoughts, and I think we're pretty much there. So hopefully you'll remember the metaphor, if nothing else. How did we come to be? Well, this little chunk of the building right here, portion of our elementary school, it was built in 1960. It was built by a group of people who deeply believed what I just said about that three-legged stool. There's the church, there's school, there's family. And they made a decision that before they even built, they were a group of Dutch immigrants, that before they even built the church, they would start with the school. And so they built that school, and they had church in the school. And they gifted, I guess we had to pay $1, I think, so I think that counts as a gift. They gifted the land on which the school is on, other than the chunk that was still their church, to the school. Because they believed deeply in this mission, this idea that when we're forming people, there's church, school, and home. And over time, we expanded. But the demographics change, and I'm going to say a few things about the Victoria Christian Reformed Church. I'm not their representative, and I don't think I'm going to say anything that any of their leadership team, because I've had plenty of talks, would disagree with, but they're a church that has struggled to move from being a church oriented towards being a missional church to Dutch immigrant families moving to Canada, to where they are now, where that pool of people is getting smaller and smaller and older and older. And so the relationship between the church and the school has changed in that at one point, the church, the Christian Reformed Church, planted the school. And now we, as part of our mission, have looked back and said, we actually want there to be a flourishing church in our midst. We'd like them, we like a ton of things. I don't have time to unpack why fully I like that, but we want there to be a flourishing church. So we looked back and said, you know, they're struggling, what can we do? And so we had this long conversation over about 2 years, which culminated in them selling their building to us, and us developing a leaseback arrangement so that they wouldn't have to worry about the building anymore. As they were shrinking in size, that became more and more difficult for them. So we're taking care of the building. They also got a fair amount of money that in their bank account. My deep hope is that they would take this moment to ask themselves the question I'm posing here, like the world has changed. What does it mean to be true to the mission and to do mission now? Something's got to change because the formula that you're using isn't working. And I think they would agree. And they've actually went to a workshop they put on a couple weeks ago on mission. It was phenomenal. So I'm very hopeful that they will take this as a moment to start something new, because that's really what I think they need to do. So really that's all I got for you. So it was just to share where we're at, some exciting stuff happening, to share this metaphor, which I think is hugely powerful. If you haven't read Canoeing the Mountains, I would say I've read like all the big Valenciano, and I mean it's super powerful. Like I would strongly encourage if you're thinking about what does it mean to be a leader in the midst of change, and talking about all the pitfalls and the things that can go wrong, and how, as I said, people will try to undermine you, but how to get through that, how to discern God's will in your place, like it's hugely powerful. Anyway, thank you so much for letting me share. It's been a real blessing for me to be part of this group. I know I'm not technically a pastor, so I appreciate your forbearance, but I do think we're doing this work together. Like I am deeply committed to sowing the gospel and moving the gospel forward in Greater Victoria. I know we have that shared hope. So I appreciate being here and learning more about the great things that are going on in Greater Victoria. So thank you again. I'll turn this over to